time is limited. Now, in the time that you have, what should you address? Should you address things that do not really lead to effective interventions? Or should you focus your energies on gathering information that can be directly translated into interventions that will enhance competencies and expand opportunities? I leave the question with you. Finally, there is well-documented research showing that the vast majority of students who are now referred by teachers for possible special education, classification, and placement are indeed placed. Several articles by Jim Eiseldike, LD Institute, articles done by other persons. One of my set questions in this presentation, when I have more time and audiences of school psychologists, is to think about what proportion of students in your district who are referred, who you evaluate, are then placed. I never get an estimate less than 65%. I often get estimates approaching 90% or more. But take a look at it in your own settings. The issue, though, is the outcomes of testing. Yes, it might be useful to know that a student has autism or some other medically related disability. But that's still, that may be useful for the parent to know, but it's useless for the individual if it does not lead to effective interventions. The principal uses of IQ tests today are related to ineffective interventions. As long as that's the case, I shall be a strong advocate of rejecting the IQ testing technology, of adopting newer technology that is related to effective interventions.
Dr. Sandoval is a professor of education at the University of California, Davis. He received his MA from the University of California at Berkeley in 1969, his PhD from Berkeley as well. Since that time, he has worked as a school psychologist, lecturer at Berkeley, and as an assistant, associate, and now full professor at UC Davis. He's a fellow of the American Orthopsychiatric Association, as well as a fellow of the American Psychological Association. He is currently president of Division 16 of APA, the Division of School Psychology. Dr. Sandoval has published over 60 articles in major journals and is a frequent presenter and consultant. His areas of research and professional interest are the prevention of school failure, the training of educational professionals, issues in applied measurement, and problems in special education. John Sandoval.
The first thing that this debate is about is the inferences that are made about general mental ability tests, and I'll elaborate on that in a moment. The other thing, the thing that's not been mentioned very clearly, is money. And I think this debate has something to do with money and the willingness for the general public to support the equal opportunity rights and privileges of all children, and some genuine concerns I have for for equity issues and for the future of both regular and special education, particularly in this state. The first person I'm going to take to task is Dan for talking about an old paradigm and a new paradigm. I have done some historical research lately, and I have come to realize that there are really two traditions in psychology, but these are both very, very old traditions. One tradition can be labeled the process or ability school. And that has been a field of psychology that developed with the faculty psychologists in the last century, and it has come on down to us as psychologists have become interested in processes and abilities and hypothetical constructs that underlie behavior and functioning. And that's a long tradition in psychology, and it has taken us in many different directions, some of them dead ends, some of them have carried on down to the current day. I think Jerry represents very clearly this tradition of looking at the importance of processes, attempting to measure them, and then attempting to translate them into meaningful intervention. And it's been a successful tradition to some extent. It continues, we continue to struggle with being psychologists, which to many of us means thinking about these hypothetical constructs. However, there is another tradition that's almost as old, and in fact, the first psychologists, I think, embodied a bit of both traditions. They were both faculty psychologists, and they were very applied, and they were very concerned about, if you take Leitner Whitmer, for example, in how children learned, how they might be re-educated and brought to their full potential. The second tradition I would call the skills, or perhaps these days the curriculum-based tradition. And this is a tradition that's probably best exemplified by the behaviorists in psychology, particularly Skinner and his descendants. The idea that while it is important to look at individuals complexly and meaningful, it's also very important to observe them very closely. And it is not necessary, holds this tradition, to look at inside the black box. It's not necessary to worry about hypothetical constructs or to measure them. Let's focus on outcomes. Let's get serious about going directly to producing those kinds of outcomes. And I see Dan Reshly fitting that tradition. At the beginnings, these distinctions weren't very clear, although Whitmer and others were faculty psychologists, as I've said. But as they tried to struggle with the problems that confronted them, they found that these artificial or these theoretical distinctions broke down rapidly in the face of real children with real problems. And I think the tradition in school psychology, or clinical psychology as it was called at the time, was anything that works. We'll try and make it meaningful, and we'll collaborate with others, and we will engage in a process of, for want of a better term, re-education. What is important about diagnosis is one where I find myself agreeing with Jerry, that there is some importance, that diagnosis is part of a process that is going to yield information that is going to help us with our interventions. I'll agree with Dan that it doesn't lead directly to effective interventions, but it will. But I'm not sure that anything can or should lead directly to effective interventions. It seems to me that interventions should be produced through a collaborative effort between different professionals acting collaboratively, where the psychologist is bringing psychological theories, principles, and ideas, and other professionals are bringing their own concepts. I do agree that diagnosis is a process that often consists of eliminating contributions to a problem. When one assesses a child, one should not, and unfortunately I think the evidence doesn't always bear me out, the psychologist shouldn't go with a battery of tests that they administer to every child. An assessment should be, I believe, a stochastic process where a question is asked, data are collected from one assessment, and each following assessment follows from what was collected. Now, your starting point in that assessment very well could be a rating scale. And in the ideal world, that could lead you in a different direction away from an IQ test or any other, or an interview with a child could also lead you off into meaningful relationships with children and meaningful planning for their educational achievement. So that the utility of many tests, particularly general cognitive tests, the utility lies in their eliminating certain assumptions about what may be happening for the child. I agree with Jerry Sattler in that it was my experience as well that in administering tests, I could not always predict what the outcome would be from my interviews and observations of the child. I could not always depend on the teacher's judgment. And in fact, through the assessment process, I was able to discover amazing facts about children, which when brought back into the educational system in multidisciplinary team meetings and in other settings, contributed to creative and dynamic thinking about all kinds of children. So that I see that there's an important need for both an assessment that is focused on the skills, and both the academic and social and emotional skills. I think that we do need to get better information about what skills a child possesses, what skills the child lacks, where the child is on a hierarchy of skills leading to competent adulthood. I think assessment should focus in that domain. At the same time, I think it's important to know how to treat the child. What particular kinds of techniques, what particular kinds of ways that we may approach the child. And I think that general mental abilities often give us information that help us collaboratively plan interventions with respect to how quickly children may be presented information, about the store of skills, knowledge, vocabulary, verbal concepts, other kinds of thinking skills that are reflected on scores, and sometimes, admittedly, on behavior on the test. I do believe that there is more that can be obtained from an IQ test than a number, and I think that's very important. So, again, I believe that intervention is not a mechanical activity, but I do acknowledge that some tragic things have come to pass over the past decade or two. I do believe that Dan is right when he says, as much as I would hate, in an ideal world I wouldn't agree with this, but I think in the real world I do believe there are forces that have led to the use of general mental ability tests for placement decisions, for eligibility. I think that most of the tests that are administered these days are indeed administered to determine eligibility, and that use of the test I find personally very distressing. I believe that interventions need to be much more varied and much more detailed and intervention planning than assigning a child to a special classroom. I'm distressed to hear Dan's data, but I again believe that special education has not been a good system for delivering individual interventions to children. And I recognize that there is a great and pressing need for reforming our educational systems delivery to children, so that the use of assessments for eligibility purposes, I think, is a distressing truth, and I too would like to see changes and evolutions created in our processes for identifying children for special help that would result in fewer uses of general mental ability scales. I don't think they're as useful as they have been legislated and claimed to be, but I still think they have some uses. Even if it is used for eligibility, and even if the rates range from 65 to 85% of children placed as planned, what does that figure mean? To one of the debaters, that means that we know what we're doing anyway. We don't really need the test to do it. On the other hand, how many kids does it take to identify through the assessment process to reconceptualize that child's life and to lead to more creative planning? How many, if there's only one child out of 100 where that's planned, does that justify the use of ability tests for everyone? Probably not. I did say that I thought this was about money. What are we going to do with respect to coming to grips with our current economic problems, with coming to grips with the apparently low priority that taxpayers and others place on children, and the troubles that the schools find themselves in where they are forced to economize in ways that no one would like to do. What seems to be suggested is that we consider much more, and I think that there are arguments to do this, that we turn to primary and secondary prevention, that we use and we turn to assessments that would help us identify children far before any problems develop and deliver interventions. I think we could spend much more of our time in trying to work with the entire educational system to create programs such as social skills training programs. Those were mentioned, but there are many others that would result in far fewer problems developing and a far greater economy of resources. And I hope that Dan is right. We have now a system that's based on tertiary prevention. What we're facing now is the fact that every general mental ability test that's administered is administered because there's a problem. Because we haven't dealt creatively and effectively with the child. And by the time a test gets to be administered, perhaps it's too late. Until we can convince policymakers that we can effectively deliver services that are more preventative in nature, that are more efficiently, and are more driven by professional advances, I think we're stuck in a very in the stance of reacting rather than being proactive. I hope Dan's right. I hope that the efforts at reform that have gone on in other states that have resulted in those 5 principles: involvement, retraining, and reconceptualization of services delivery. I hope that's in our future. There's always going to be some children who are going to need tertiary prevention, though. There are always going to be kids who are going to fall through the cracks. And we're always going to need to be there in a role that is going to lead to better intervention for children, and it will be intervention with very difficult cases, and those will be cases for which general mental ability assessments will contribute in a meaningful way to that planning.
Mr. Honig, Superintendent of Education of the state of California, was interviewed on an ABC show, I think it's September of this year, along with myself, and he estimated that it costs $1,200 to conduct an IQ assessment. And he said, with that $1,200, we can do other things. And that money belongs in the classroom and not for school psychology services. So I wonder if Dan is right about California. If Mr. Honig has his way, will there be a school psychology program offered to children? I haven't read the Oakland glutting material very carefully. I am familiar with it, but it seems to me that it's very important that a child who's referred for being hyperactive, destructive, uncooperative, within a 2-hour period with the school psychologist is cooperative, non-hyperactive, and it doesn't generalize outside. I think that's extremely valuable information to know that under certain conditions this particular behavior is in a child's repertoire. Extremely important. I'm puzzled by the term curricula-based assessment. Every day my son brings home some kind of paper from school. Isn't this curriculum-based assessment? Isn't the spelling test, the reading test, the math test a test of curriculum-based assessment? What do I know as a school psychologist or clinical psychologist that the teacher who's with this child 30 hours a week doesn't know? So I'm not sure when we bandy around this word curriculum-based assessment, whether it hasn't been with us since school started from the beginning. I was really surprised when Dan mentioned earlier adaptive behavior. My reading of the literature indicates that this is the poorest, unsophisticated, invalid, unreliable tool, perhaps in the psychologist's armamentarium. Edward Ziegler, one of the foremost psychologists in the United States, if not the world, the first director of Head Start, has recently indicated that the AAMD standards are wrong. The only criterion for mental deficiency or mental retardation should be a significantly below average IQ. We just cannot validate adaptive behavior. We don't know what it means. We don't know how to assess it. And current tools are extremely primitive in these areas. I heartily agree with Dan and the comments that Jonathan made, that we want to train teachers to be more alert, to be more perspective, to rate children better, to identify their strengths and weaknesses. I think that's very good, and I'm obviously for that 100%. Throughout my career as a teacher and writer, I have always advocated that any placement decision should be based upon clinical judgment and not solely on a criterion of 70 or below or 130 or above. I always have maintained that the team, the psychologist's judgment, using less, quote, reliable and valid measures should be incorporated into any kind of diagnostic and placement decision. I'm very impressed with the movement going on in the 80s called information processing. I think it's very important to be part of our assessment to learn how children learn, how LD children process information, what kind of feedback they get, how they know whether they're wrong or not, what are there avenues that they could use to solve problems. I see cognitive assessment as part of the information processing movement. I think it's a vital area of research. There's tremendous movement going on with computer-based now cognitive assessment and memory and information processing. There are excellent tools in the assessment of memory deficits, and I think we're going to see a continued research in a very robust field of cognitive assessment and development. And finally, again, I have to disagree with my esteemed colleague. I think a 15-point decrement of 150 to 135 is meaningless, and a 15-point increase from 40 to 55 is meaningless. So in the long run, I still maintain that the research is absolutely without doubt indicating that the stability of the IQ is one of the best known findings that we have in the field. Thank you.
I guess if a 15-point difference is trivial, perhaps we'll use that as the standard error of measurement in the future. That it doesn't really matter if the kid's ability is 85 or 100. That will certainly change the LD discrepancy formula. Of course, they're not very precise anyway. Professor Sattler talked about adaptive behavior. He cited an article by Ziegler, Bala, and Hodap that appeared in the American Journal of Mental Deficiency in 1984. That article appeared prior to the publication of 3 nationally standardized, technically adequate adaptive behavior scales. In point of fact, the measurement of social competence, including social skills, has improved dramatically over the last 8 or 9 years. Moreover, social competence measures have a closer relationship to early adult adjustment for students with disabilities than IQ per se. I would argue that we need to place a great deal more emphasis on social competencies or adaptive skills. That greater emphasis will be reflected in the next revision that'll be out over this next year in the American Association on Mental Retardation classification in mental retardation. I think Professor Sattler suggested that adaptive behavior assessment was highly inaccurate. I would suggest that the assessment using techniques like drawing trees. Somebody called me a few years ago and wanted to know about the Bush test. It took me a little while to realize they were talking about the house tree person. At least I think that's what they were talking about. Making inferences about emotional status based on the bender. The issue with assessment, though, is to what extent can you translate that information into interventions for students? In point of fact, the CBM technology is new. Curriculum-based measurement procedures that yield reliable and valid information on students that can be used directly in programming. That is relatively new, no older than about 6 years. My colleagues talk about how IQ can change perceptions and lead to a dynamic process, but they don't talk about the interventions and the evaluation of those interventions, nor trying to show that those interventions confer advantages over the alternative of leaving the child in regular education, over alternative interventions that would not use cognitive assessment. If you want to see changes in perceptions by teachers, and if you want to see children's academic efficacy improve, please learn CBM. Take a few kids through CBM with formative evaluation. That involves precise identification of skills, development of goals, application of powerful behavior change principles, frequent monitoring of progress at least 3 times a week. And if kids are achieving above the goal line, you raise the goal. If they're achieving below the goal line, you bring in more intensive instruction. You graph that for kids and for teachers. Adding points to the graph 3 times a week. Do that over 6 weeks. And I'll assure you, you'll see changes in perceptions of students. And I will also predict you'll see changes in academic self-efficacy. Very important changes. Children who learn different attributions. Children who learn that with effort and time they can achieve. As opposed to the attribution that the only way I can get it whenever I am successful, it's luck, happenstance, or something else. Very likely the importance of IQ at any age has been overrated. After school entrance, it is clear that mental testing adds little knowledge of child ability that could not be secured by an analysis of academic records based on cumulative and reliable measurements in the standard school subject matter. Note the date, George Stoddard, 1940. Stoddard was right, but the technology was not yet available. The technology has been established over the last 6 or 7 years through work by Stan Dino, Ed Shapiro, Mark Shin, several other persons around the United States. What is CBM? CBM is the application of behavior assessment procedures to specific school subject matter. CBM with graphing, with formative evaluation, has a 0.7 standard deviation effect. The other programs we've talked about have negligible benefits. If it's my child, or if I'm a social policy maker, I'm going to try to emphasize a system that has a strong treatment effect. Thank you.
Dr. Sattler, this is addressed to you. I think he failed also to mention that the eugenicists believed in the superiority of whites, especially Nordic whites, and that the development of IQ tests was one of their primary missions, okay, and that all of the tests that were developed early on were developed by these people, including Terman, who, as I'm sure you know, worked on the Stanford Binet, which you are affiliated with. I think that this is a very important point when you're looking at IQ tests, and I'd like for you to respond to that. You also failed to mention that Binet cautioned people not to use his scales as a fixed unitary measure, and his scales were developed for the purpose of intervention, and the purpose was distorted by Terman and people who were working with him in the eugenics movement. And that led to the development of what Reshly referred to as the old paradigm, which is leaving. Had that distortion not occurred, I do believe that we would have a very different perspective on IQ tests.
In mentioning Wundt and Galton and Binet in the same 1-minute period, I was trying to briefly indicate the history of mental testing. Galton, like Terman and Binet, had many, many interests, and I cannot say it more strongly. I think using tests for any eugenic purposes is destructive and harmful. And I agree with your comments. Terman's been accused of a lot of things, but he also brought some kind of objectivity to our field. He stimulated testing. He gave us studies of the gifted, And people have their faults. And if I don't bring those up, it's because I'm not talking about Galton as a person and his breadth. I'm talking about Galton setting up one of the first laboratories to